Thank you very much. As Jess, yesterday I also have to do some outing. I do work for the European Union, but I'm here entirely in my personal capacity. At the moment, I'm not even working on Ukraine for the European Union. But I was in Ukraine from May to August to conduct an assessment mission, and I traveled a lot through the regions. In particular, between May and June, I visited 6 regions from east to west, and in this period, the presidential elections actually worked as a clear watershed in what was the general feeling before and what was the feeling afterwards. I mean, there was I had the feeling that I could hear a collective sense of relief with the election of Poroshenko, because before, at the regional level, there was a perception of, anarchy, could we call it like that? There was a feeling that nobody's really in charge, nobody's going to defend us, and the only place of authority is actually at the regional level. After that, I mean, maybe this feeling is somehow biased by the fact that I traveled to the southeast before the elections, and I was in the western regions after the elections. But after the elections, I mean, there was the clear perception that finally somebody has come who's going to defend Ukraine, defend our collective interests. He's going to be the protector of human rights. He's going to be the only legitimate authority that is going to negotiate in the war for us, and is going to bring some peace and stability finally at the general level. Now, in my paper, there are a couple of points actually that I want to discuss today, and both of them have somehow come out already in the discussions yesterday. In particular, I mean, in what Mikhailo was saying. The first point is the emergence of civil society as a security actor, and the second is the implosion of the state authorities. The fact that, I mean, at the central and in a different way at the regional level, the authorities were not capable to provide their basic functions, and civil society intervened to fill in the gap and to provide those services. Now, I know that this is controversial and maybe not necessarily politically correct, but I wonder, what do you think? Whether we can talk about a failed state, a failing state, before Maidan, immediately after Maidan. I mean, you know better than me that for at least a week the police disappeared from the streets. There was a general feeling that people had to take arms, to take weapons in their own hands to defend themselves, their families, the city they were working in. And I mean, looking at the relationship between the center and the regions, it was very clear that at a regional level, the perception was that Kiev could not control anything. Kiev could not provide any guarantee for anything. And this was perceptible, particularly from a security point of view. Institutions were discredited. I mean, the anti-corruption, the corruption schemes had come out clearly. I mean, in the paper, I also mentioned this parallel institution of the Smatriashi that had been established in basically almost all the regions. And I refer to the Maidan movement, as many of you have already said, a movement for dignity, where people actually wanted to reject entirely these corruption schemes, which were affecting their daily life. So it's not necessarily an ideological revolution, but it's a revolution to get a better life, as other people had mentioned yesterday. And then, of course, I mean, the massive human rights violations, Berkut's shooting on the people, I mean, this discredited completely the authorities and gave the feeling that, well, we need to intervene to protect ourselves. There was no chain of command, there was a very clear impression that there was no chain of command anymore between the center and the regions. I heard the story from a journalist in Luhansk who told us about a volunteer battalion from the National Guard, which had defended the city buildings, had managed to keep at bay the pro-Russian rebels. Then they were forced to give in, and then they were kicked out to the margins of the city. They camped out for some time in the outskirts of the town. And they were waiting for instructions from Kiev, and these instructions failed to arrive. They were waiting for food, water provisions, and I mean, there was nothing coming from Kiev. I mean, it was just the good hearts and the charity of the local population that kept them alive. And I'm sure that you've all heard stories like this. Another element was that I noticed was that there was a general uncertainty on the legal framework that was to be applied. I mean, I will refer to this a little bit more later on, but I mean, there were civil society councils that emerged in support of the city administrations, the Samabarona groups, I mean, a number of formations that emerged at a regional and a national level. And in every region, I asked, what is the piece of legislation you are referring to? Is there a decree? Is there a law that justifies this? And I have to say that in almost every region, I got a different answer, which, well, it's not entirely reassuring because then everyone interprets the situation the way they want to. And then, I mean, there was the question that also emerged yesterday about the role of the oligarchs in terms of security provision. Providers, actually. The feeling that one had was that actually the central authorities had outsourced security provision to the oligarchs because they could not control the situation themselves. So, I mean, there was a feeling that medieval city-states were emerging everywhere in Ukraine, and the only way for Kiev to keep everything under control was to strike strategic deals with Taruta, with Kolomoisky, with anyone else. So, I mean, it was okay for Kolomoisky to pay from his own pocket to set up Samabarona groups. It was okay for Taruta to pay for the digging of ditches to protect against Russia. This was acceptable. Now, in other regions, which actually were endowed with less powerful oligarchs, the feeling was that the local authorities, which in a way had changed, I mean, the top management of most local authorities did change as a result of the Maidan, but they felt so shaky and uncertain that they themselves, the governors and the heads of the local law enforcement agencies, had to construct a web of alliances. Especially, I mean, they referred to the local business or to the NGOs to legitimize and provide resources for primarily the defense of the city. I mean, I remember arriving in Zaporozhye, and there was an anxiety. I mean, that the city was about to be invaded, and the very first thing they asked was, "Can you provide us weapons?" And they told us that they were somehow, well, I mean, of course it was very difficult, but they were helping people to get weapons somewhere. Or I remember in Ivano-Frankivsk, for example, I mean, we were told that, of course, it was after the election, so I mean, the atmosphere changed, and in Ivano-Frankivsk there was no feeling, no anxiety of a possible invasion. But there were battalions that were being prepared to fight in the east. And people had no equipment. I mean, the people had no weapons. People had no bronegileti. So the local authorities were actually playing a central role in actually collecting money and buying all this equipment for the staff. Under these conditions, I mean, of course, it's almost understandable that civil society has played a key role in this process, both in terms of the security provider. I mean, the groups of Sama Barona that were patrolling the streets at a time when the police disappeared, actually shadowed the police at the time when the police came back, but still, I mean, popular trust was very shaky, to the point, I mean, in Lutsk, for example, I mean, the police, if there was an incident, the police would call Sama Barona and ask them to intervene in minor offenses, but I mean, they thought it was more appropriate for Sama Barona to intervene. Provider of security, but also a source of legitimacy. I mentioned earlier on, and maybe, I mean, we'll discuss it later, but there were a number, I mean, all these organizations, all these regional authorities set up civil society councils. I understand, but on this I'm not sure myself because of the indications that I got. I understand that there were provisions for these councils already in the legislation set up before in the Yushchenko years and in the Yanukovych years. But nobody had really implemented them. And then all of a sudden, the authorities felt that, I mean, they needed some sort of, legitimization, recognition. Same thing with these councils for the police. I mean, we can ask whether these groups were authentic, sometimes they were Karmanny NGOs, but I mean, we can discuss this later. Now, for my conclusions, I agree that the Maidan movement was a movement for dignity, and I mean, the emergence of civil society as a security actor reflects this quest for dignity. I mean, my feeling is that civil society will remain as an important actor in security until the full trust and the full legitimacy of the authorities is restored, both at the national and at a regional level. But then the question that I would like to leave for you is whether civil society engagement in security is a positive phenomenon. I mean, of course, it is important that, I mean, there are key functions that can be performed by civil society from this point of view. I mean, there is a need for oversight, for democratic oversight on the provision of security. But then there are some key functions in terms of security that need to be performed by the state. And I just wanted to quote, to finish, a report from the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights. He visited Ukraine in February, and he was discussing also the involvement of these groups in police functions. He said that these practices distort perception about the police as a neutral institution established to uphold the rule of law and are highly likely to lead to the escalation of violence by exacerbating fault lines within society. Thank you.